The digital clock on Emma Rodriguez's nightstand glowed 11:47 p.m. when the first crash of thunder shook her small bedroom in Millfield, Ohio. 8-year-old Emma had always been afraid of storms, but tonight something felt different, more sinister. The October wind howled through the maple trees outside her window, their bare branches scraping against the glass like skeletal fingers trying to get inside. Emma pulled her pink Disney princess blanket up to her chin and squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the storm. Her mother, Maria, worked the night shift at the hospital, and her father wouldn't be home from his trucking route until Thursday. The babysitter, Mrs. Chun from down the street, had fallen asleep on the couch hours ago, leaving Emma alone with her fears and the raging tempest outside. Another thunderclap exploded overhead. This one so violent, it rattled the windows and made Emma's collection of ceramic horses dance on their shelf. But as the rumbling faded, she heard something else, something that made her blood freeze in her veins. The sound of splintering wood, and a woman's terrified scream pierced through the storm like a knife through silk. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs as she crept from her bed toward the window. Her bare feet touched the cold hardwood floor, sending shivers up her spine. She pushed aside the cheerful yellow curtains her mother had sewn just last month and peered into the darkness next door. Mrs. Catherine Williams' house, usually warm and welcoming with its flower garden and white picket fence, looked like something from a nightmare. The elderly woman's front door hung open at an unnatural angle, one hinge completely destroyed. Through the gaping entrance, Emma could see shadows moving violently in the lit hallway. Mrs. Williams, the kind woman who always gave Emma homemade cookies and helped her with math. Homework, was screaming for help in a voice Emma had never heard before. Raw and desperate, 3 figures in dark clothing and masks moved through Mrs. Williams' house like predators stalking prey. Emma pressed her face against the cold glass, her breath fogging the window as she watched in horrified fascination. The tallest intruder, clearly the leader, barked orders in a harsh voice that carried across the storm. He wore a black ski mask, but his eyes were visible, cold, calculating blue eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. Emma watched as the second intruder, shorter and stockier, ransacked Mrs. Williams' living room, throwing her precious antiques and family photos to the floor with reckless abandon. The sound of breaking glass mixed with the old woman's pleas created a symphony of terror that would haunt Emma's dreams forever. The third figure, slender and wearing a bright red jacket that stood out against the darkness, stood guard by the broken door, constantly scanning the street for witnesses. Mrs. Williams appeared in Emma's view, stumbling backward as the tall leader advanced on her. The 70-year-old retired teacher who had taught Emma's mother decades ago looked so fragile, so helpless against these monsters invading her sanctuary. Emma wanted to scream, to call for help, to do something, anything, but her vocal cords felt paralyzed by the sheer terror of what she was witnessing. The leader grabbed Mrs. Williams by her gray hair, and Emma saw the flash of something metallic in his other hand. The old woman's screams became more desperate, more primal. Emma's hands flew to her mouth, stifling her own cry of horror as she watched the unthinkable unfold before her innocent eyes. Then it happened. The moment that would steal Emma's voice forever. The tall intruder with the cold blue eyes suddenly stopped his assault and slowly turned toward Emma's house. His head tilted slightly, like a wolf sensing prey, and those terrifying eyes began scanning the windows of the Rodriguez home. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she realized with dawning horror that the living room light was still on downstairs, and her silhouette might be visible against her bedroom curtains. Time seemed to freeze as the masked man's gaze found her window. Even through the storm and darkness, even across the 20 feet separating their properties, Emma felt those ice blue eyes lock onto hers with laser precision. The intruder raised his arm slowly, deliberately, and pointed directly at her. Gesture that promised unspeakable consequences. If she dared to speak of what she had witnessed, the message was crystal clear. I see you, little girl. I know where you live. I know who you are. Emma stumbled backward from the window, her legs giving out beneath her as she collapsed onto her bedroom floor. Her whole body trembled uncontrollably as the reality of her situation crashed over her. Like a tidal wave, she had witnessed something horrible, something that would put 3 dangerous criminals in prison for life. But that same knowledge made her a target. She crawled back to her bed on shaking hands and knees, pulling the covers over her head as if they could protect her from the evil she had seen. Outside, she could hear car doors slamming, engines starting, and tires squealing against wet pavement as the intruders made their escape. Mrs. Williams' screams had stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that was somehow even more terrifying. When the police sirens finally wailed through the storm 30 minutes later, Emma remained hidden under her blankets, frozen in terror. Officers Torres and Mitchell would find Mrs. Williams unconscious and barely breathing, her house ransacked, her life forever changed by 3 minutes of violence. But they would never find Emma that night. When they knocked on doors asking for witnesses, Mrs. Chun gradually answered, reporting that she had seen and heard nothing. Emma remained silent in her bed, knowing that speaking up would paint a target on her family's back. From that moment forward, Emma Rodriguez never spoke another word. The terror of those cold blue eyes had stolen her voice as surely as if someone had reached into her throat and ripped out her vocal cords. 127 days would pass before she would speak again, and when she finally did, it would be to a 4-legged hero who would help her find justice for Mrs. Williams and courage for herself. Detective Sarah Mitchell stared at the crime scene photos scattered across her desk, her 4th cup of coffee growing cold in the January morning light. 3 months had passed since the brutal attack on Catherine Williams, and the case had become her obsession. The evidence board behind her looked like a spiderweb of dead ends red string, connecting suspects who had alibis, witnesses who saw nothing, and leads that evaporated like morning fog. The attack had been vicious and methodical. Mrs. Williams lay in room 314 at Millfield General Hospital, trapped in a medically induced coma after suffering severe head trauma. The doctor said she might never wake up, and even if she did, the brain damage could leave her unable to remember that terrible night. 3 masked intruders had ransacked her home, stealing over $30,000 in cash she'd kept hidden in her bedroom money she'd been saving for her granddaughter's college fund. Sarah rubbed her tired eyes and picked up the forensic report for the 100th time. The perpetrators had been smart, wearing gloves and shoe covers, but they'd made one crucial mistake. DNA evidence found on a broken picture frame had identified 3 suspects. Jake Morrison, 28, a career criminal with a rap sheet longer than Sarah's arm. Tommy Chun, 24, Morrison's frequent accomplice with a history of breaking and entering. And Lisa Brooks, 31, the brains of the operation who specialized in casing wealthy elderly targets. All 3 had been arrested within weeks of the attack, sitting smugly in their jail cells, while their high-priced defense attorney, David Kumar, worked every legal angle to get them released. Kumar had already succeeded in getting their bail reduced, arguing that the DNA evidence was circumstantial and that no witness could place his clients at the scene. The prosecution's case was crumbling, and Sarah knew it. The detective's phone buzzed, displaying a familiar number that made her stomach clench with guilt. Maria Rodriguez had called every single day for 3 months, asking the same desperate question. Have you found a way to help my Emma speak? Each conversation broke Sarah's heart a little more. Detective Mitchell speaking, Sarah answered, though she already knew what was coming. Detective, it's Maria Rodriguez. I'm calling about Emma. Dr. Harrison tried something new yesterday, music therapy, but she just sat there staring at the wall. She won't even look at her favorite toys anymore. Please, you have to help us. She's the only witness, and she's dying inside. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the first time she'd met 8-year-old Emma. The little girl had been found huddled in her bedroom the morning after the attack, catatonic with fear. Her normally bright brown eyes had become vacant, staring at nothing. Emma hadn't spoken a single word since that night, not to her mother, not to doctors, not to the parade of specialists who tried to reach her. Dr. James Harrison, Millfields, leading child psychologist, had tried everything in his considerable arsenal. Traditional talk therapy had failed completely. Emma simply sat motionless in his office chair, unresponsive to questions or encouragement. Art therapy sessions ended with blank paper and untouched crayons. Play therapy resulted in Emma curling into a ball in the corner, ignoring every toy and game Dr. Harrison offered. We even tried hypnosis, Dr. Harrison had reported to Sarah. Last week, his usually confident demeanor showing cracks of frustration. Emma's trauma response is unlike anything I've encountered in 20 years of practice. It's as if she's built an impenetrable wall around herself. Whatever she witnessed that night has locked her voice away completely. The most heartbreaking part was watching Emma's transformation from the vibrant, chatty child she'd once been. Maria had shown Sarah home videos from Emma's 8th birthday party just 2 weeks before the attack. The little girl in those videos was full of life, laughing as she opened presents, chattering excitedly about starting 3rd grade, singing along to Disney songs with pure joy. Now, Emma moved through life like a ghost, mechanically eating when prompted, sleeping fitfully, attending school but participating in nothing. Her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, reported that Emma had become completely isolated from her classmates. She no longer raised her hand, never smiled at jokes, and spent recess sitting alone under the oak tree, staring at nothing. The other children had initially tried to include her, but Emma's silence eventually created an invisible barrier that even 8-year-olds couldn't cross. Sarah had consulted with FBI behavioral analysts, child trauma experts from Cleveland Clinic, and even a specialist from Johns Hopkins who dealt specifically with selective mutism in children. Every expert reached the same conclusion. Emma's psychological wounds were too deep for conventional therapy to reach quickly enough to save the case against her attackers. The legal clock was ticking mercilessly. Judge Hendricks had already granted 2 continuances, but his patience was wearing thin. Kumar had filed motions to dismiss all charges, arguing that the prosecution couldn't prove his clients were even at the scene without witness testimony. The DNA evidence alone wasn't enough. Could have been transferred innocently. Kumar claimed, since Morrison had done yard work for elderly residents in the neighborhood months earlier. Sarah knew that in 6 weeks, if Emma couldn't testify, 3 violent criminals would walk free. Morrison alone had been suspected in 4 other home invasions targeting elderly victims, but prosecutors had never gathered enough evidence for convictions. Mrs. Williams would become another statistic, another elderly victim failed by a system that couldn't protect her. The detective was reviewing security camera footage from the night of the attack when Officer Michael Torres knocked on her cubicle wall. Torres was a 15-year veteran of the force, respected by everyone in the department for his calm demeanor and innovative approaches to community policing. He'd been Morrison's arresting officer and had followed the case closely. Sarah, I've been thinking about the Rodriguez girl, Torres said, settling into the chair across from her desk. My partner and I just retired from active K-9 duty last month. Rex is 7 years old, still sharp as a tack, but department policy requires retirement after 6 years of service. Sarah looked up from her files, intrigued by the thoughtful tone in Torres's voice. What are you thinking, Mike? Torres leaned forward, his weathered face serious. Rex has always had this gift with kids. I've seen him calm crying toddlers at accident scenes, help lost children find their parents at community events, even sit quietly with kids during domestic violence calls when they were too scared to talk to adults. That dog is magic when it comes to reaching traumatized children. Sarah felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. She'd heard about therapy animals being used in hospitals and nursing homes, but never in a criminal case. It was unconventional, possibly unprecedented. But conventional approaches had failed Emma completely. Do you think Rex could help Emma? Torres smiled for the first time since the conversation began. I think it's worth a try. That dog has spent 6 years reading human emotions and responding to people in crisis. If anyone can reach that little girl, it's Rex. Neither of them could have imagined that this conversation would lead to a legal revolution that would change courtrooms across America forever. The Millfield Community Center's therapy room had been transformed into something resembling a child's bedroom rather than a clinical space. Dr. Harrison had learned from 3 months of failures that sterile environments only reinforced Emma's trauma-induced isolation. Soft throw pillows decorated the floor, children's books lined low shelves, and warm yellow lighting replaced the harsh fluorescence that reminded Emma too much of the police station where she'd been questioned repeatedly in those first terrible days. Maria Rodriguez sat anxiously in the observation room next door, watching her daughter through a two-way mirror. Emma occupied her usual spot, a small blue chair, pushed into the corner where she could see all entrances and exits. A survival instinct that had developed since that horrific October night. The 8-year-old sat motionless, her dark hair hanging like a curtain around her face, her small hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. She hasn't moved in 20 minutes, Maria whispered to Dr. Harrison, her voice thick with unshed tears. It's like watching a living statue. My baby is disappearing before my eyes, and I don't know how to bring her back. Dr. Harrison adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, studying Emma's body language with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 2 decades decoding childhood trauma. Every detail told the story of a child trapped in perpetual fight-or-flight mode. Emma's shoulders remained hunched defensively, her breathing shallow and controlled, her eyes darting occasionally toward the door as if expecting those masked intruders to materialize at any moment. Today might be different, Dr. Harrison said, softly, though he'd said similar words many times before. Officer Torres believes Rex has a special gift for connecting with children who have experienced trauma. Outside in the hallway, Officer Michael Torres was having his own quiet conversation with his retired partner. Rex, a magnificent German shepherd with intelligent golden brown eyes and a coat that shimmered between black and tan, sat at perfect attention beside his handler. At 7 years old, Rex was in his prime, still athletic and alert, but with the wisdom and patience that came from years of reading human emotions and responding to crisis situations. Okay, partner, Torres murmured, running his weathered hand through Rex's thick fur. This little girl has been through hell. She's not going to trust easily, and she's not going to respond like the kids we've worked with before. You're going to need all that magic you've got. Rex tilted his head slightly, a gesture Torres had learned to interpret as understanding. During their 6 years of partnership, Rex had demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to sense human distress. He'd found lost children hiding in terror, comforted victims of domestic violence who couldn't stop shaking, and somehow knew exactly when to approach and when to maintain distance. Torres had seen Rex work with dozens of traumatized children, but never one as deeply wounded as Emma Rodriguez. Dr. Harrison opened the therapy room door slowly, allowing Torres and Rex to enter with minimal disruption. Emma's head snapped up. At the sound, her body tensing like a coiled spring ready to bolt. Her dark eyes, which had been vacant for months, suddenly became hyper-alert as she took in the presence of the large dog. Rex immediately assessed the situation with the instincts of a trained law enforcement officer. He noted Emma's defensive posture, her elevated breathing, the way she pressed herself deeper into her corner chair. Most dogs might have approached eagerly, seeking attention and affection, but Rex had learned that traumatized individuals needed to feel in control of interactions. Instead of moving toward Emma, Rex positioned himself in the center of the room and simply lay down, resting his large head on his front paws. He made no sudden movements, no attempts to approach, no demanding eye contact that might feel threatening. Rex simply existed in the space, radiating the calm, steady energy that had made him legendary among Millfield's first responders. Minutes passed in complete silence. Maria watched from the observation room, her heart breaking as she saw her daughter's internal struggle playing out across her expressive face. Emma stared at Rex with a mixture of curiosity and terror, as if trying to determine whether this new presence represented another threat to her fragile sense of safety. Rex remained motionless, except for the gentle rise and fall of his chest. Occasionally, his ears would twitch at sounds from the hallway, but his gaze never wavered from a neutral point on the floor that allowed Emma to observe him without feeling pressured by direct eye contact. Torres had taught Rex this technique years ago. Let the other person control the pace of interaction. Never force connection. Always be patient. After 25 minutes, something shifted in Emma's rigid posture. Her shoulders dropped almost imperceptibly, and her breathing deepened slightly. Rex sensed the change immediately, though he maintained his peaceful position. His tail gave the smallest of wags against the carpeted floor, not excited or demanding. Just a gentle acknowledgement of Emma's presence. Emma's eyes widened at the subtle tail movement. For the first time in months, something other than fear flickered across her face. It wasn't quite curiosity, not yet trust, but perhaps the tiniest crack in the wall she'd built around herself. Rex waited another 15 minutes before making his next move. With the slow, deliberate motion of someone approaching a wild animal, he shifted his position just slightly, angling his body more toward Emma while keeping his head down in a non-threatening posture. The movement brought him perhaps 18 inches closer to her chair, but still well outside what might feel like her personal space. Emma's breathing quickened for a moment, her flight response triggering, but Rex immediately froze in place, projecting calm stability until she settled again. Torres watched from across the room, amazed by his partner's intuitive understanding of trauma responses. In 6 years of police work, he'd never seen Rex demonstrate such patience and sensitivity. The breakthrough came in the 47th minute of their first session. Emma, who had been clutching her hands in her lap since the session began, slowly extended one small finger toward Rex. She didn't leave her chair, didn't move her body closer, but that single finger stretched out like a bridge across the chasm of her fear. Rex's eyes shifted slightly to track the movement, but he remained motionless as Emma's finger hovered in the air between them. For 30 seconds, they stayed frozen in this position, a traumatized child reaching toward hope and a wise dog patient enough to let her set the terms. Then, with courage that had taken 3 months to gather, Emma leaned forward, just far enough to brush the tip of her finger against Rex's soft ear. The contact lasted less than a second before she yanked her hand back. But Rex's tail thumped once against the floor, in gentle acknowledgement. In the observation room, Maria gasped and pressed her hand to her mouth. Dr. Harrison made a quick note in his file, documenting the first voluntary physical contact Emma had initiated with any living being since the attack. Rex closed his eyes contentedly, as if that brief touch had been the greatest gift he'd ever received. He didn't move toward Emma, didn't try to capitalize on the moment, just accepted her offering of trust with the grace of a therapy animal who understood that healing happens one small step at a time. When the session ended an hour later, Emma still hadn't spoken, but something fundamental had changed in her demeanor. As Torres prepared to leave with Rex, Emma did something that shocked everyone in the room. She stood up from her chair, the first time she'd moved voluntarily during a therapy session, and took a single step toward the door where Rex was waiting. It wasn't much, but it was everything. The miracle worker with 4 paws had begun the slow process of bringing Emma Rodriguez back to the world of the living. District Attorney Patricia Walsh paced the length of her corner office like a caged tiger, her heels clicking against the polished hardwood floor with increasing urgency. Outside her window, the February snow fell steadily on downtown Millfield. But inside, the heat of legal pressure was suffocating. Spread across her mahogany desk were 3 case files that represented either the biggest triumph or most devastating failure of her 15-year career as a prosecutor. Jake Morrison, Tommy Chun, and Lisa Brooks, 3 career criminals who had terrorized elderly residents across 3 counties, sat smugly in their jail cells while their defense attorney systematically dismantled the prosecution's case. David Kumar, a slick criminal defense lawyer from Columbus with a reputation for getting the guilty off on technicalities, had already succeeded in poking holes in every piece of evidence the state had assembled. The DNA on the picture frame could have been transferred weeks earlier when my client Morrison did yard work in the neighborhood, Kumar had argued during the last hearing, his expensive suit and polished demeanor making him look more like a corporate executive than someone defending violent criminals. My clients have alibis for the night in question. They were playing poker at Morrison's apartment, witnessed by 3 reliable character witnesses. Patricia knew those reliable witnesses were Morrison's girlfriend, his cousin, and a neighbor, who owed him money, but proving perjury would require resources and time she didn't have. The poker game alibi was flimsy, but without Emma's testimony placing the defendants at the scene, it might be enough to create reasonable doubt. The prosecutor stopped pacing and stared at the crime scene photographs pinned to her bulletin board. Catherine Williams' destroyed living room told a story of methodical violence, overturned furniture, shattered family heirlooms, and blood stains that painted a picture of an elderly woman fighting for her life. Mrs. Williams remained in her medically induced coma, her doctors uncertain whether she would ever regain consciousness, let alone remember the night that nearly killed her. Patricia's phone buzzed with a text from Detective Mitchell. Emergency meeting needed. Potential breakthrough with Emma Rodriguez. Conference room 3, 20 minutes. 23 minutes later, Patricia found herself in a room that felt more like a war council than a legal consultation. Detective Mitchell sat across from her, flanked by Dr. Harrison, Officer Torres, and surprisingly, Judge Robert Hendricks himself. The judge's presence immediately told Patricia this wasn't going to be a conventional discussion. Patricia, Judge Hendricks began, his weathered face grave with the weight of what he was about to propose. What I'm going to suggest will either revolutionize how we handle child witnesses or end my 30-year career on the bench. Dr. Harrison, please explain your recommendation. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat nervously, adjusting his glasses as he consulted his notes. Over the past 3 weeks, Emma Rodriguez has made remarkable progress in her sessions with Rex, Officer Torres's retired canine partner. She's begun responding to simple gestures, maintaining brief eye contact, and yesterday, for the first time since October, she smiled when Rex performed a trick. Patricia leaned forward, her prosecutor's instincts immediately sensing where this was heading. Doctor, with all due respect, smiling at a dog doesn't mean she's ready to testify against 3 violent criminals who threatened her life. Absolutely right, Dr. Harrison acknowledged. But Emma has begun attempting to vocalize in Rex's presence. Nothing coherent yet, just soft sounds humming, occasional whispers, but it's the first time her vocal cords have produced any sound in 4 months. More importantly, she's only doing this when Rex is physically present. Remove the dog from the room, and she retreats back into complete silence. Officer Torres spoke up, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 6 years reading. Rex's ability to work with traumatized individuals. Rex has an uncanny ability to sense when someone is ready to take the next step in their healing process. Yesterday, during Emma's session, Rex moved closer to her chair than he ever has before. Emma didn't retreat. She actually reached out and touched his head for nearly 10 seconds. Judge Hendricks removed his reading glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. At 68, he had presided over thousands of cases, from petty theft to capital murder, but nothing had prepared him for this ethical and legal minefield. Dr. Harrison, in your professional opinion, would Emma be able to testify in court if Rex were present to provide emotional support? I believe it's our only chance, Dr. Harrison replied firmly. Emma's trauma response is specifically triggered by feeling vulnerable and exposed. A courtroom full of strangers, facing the very criminals who threatened her, would normally send her into complete psychological shutdown. But with Rex present, she has a source of emotional stability that might allow her to access her voice long enough to tell her story. Patricia felt her legal training warring with her desire for justice. What you're proposing is unprecedented. No court in Ohio has ever allowed a therapy animal to accompany a child witness during testimony. The defense will go ballistic, claiming it's prejudicial to the jury, a sympathy play designed to influence the verdict. They're absolutely right, Judge Hendricks said bluntly. It will influence the jury. But so does letting 3 violent criminals walk free because an 8-year-old victim is too traumatized to speak. We have to balance the rights of the defendants against the rights of the victim and society's interest in justice. Detective Mitchell pulled out a thick folder and slid it across the table to Patricia. Kumar has already filed a motion to dismiss all charges, claiming prosecutorial misconduct for continuing to pursue a case without viable witnesses. He's scheduled a press conference for tomorrow, calling our investigation a witch hunt against innocent men and demanding immediate release of his clients. Patricia opened the folder and felt her stomach drop. Kumar's motion was thorough, well-researched, and devastatingly effective. He had systematically attacked every piece of evidence, every procedural decision, every aspect of the investigation. Without Emma's testimony, the case would be dismissed within a week. There's something else, Torres added quietly. Morrison has been making threats from his jail cell. He told another inmate that if he gets out, he's going to finish what he started with witnesses who might cause him problems. The jail recorded the conversation, but it's vague enough that Kumar could argue it wasn't specifically threatening. Emma. Judge Hendricks stood up slowly, the weight of his decision evident in every movement. I've spent the weekend researching legal precedents for emotional support animals in courtrooms. There are exactly 3 cases in the entire United States where therapy dogs have been permitted during testimony, 2 in California and 1 in New York. All 3 involved child witnesses in sexual abuse cases, and all 3 resulted in successful prosecutions. Patricia realized she was holding her breath. What are you saying, Your Honor? I'm saying that justice sometimes requires us to break new legal ground. Emma Rodriguez deserves the chance to tell her story, and society deserves to hear it. If a therapy dog is what it takes to give her that voice, then we're going to make legal history. Dr. Harrison leaned forward intently. Your Honor, there are strict protocols for courtroom therapy animals. Rex would need additional certification, specialized training for the courtroom environment, and medical documentation of his necessity for Emma's testimony. A process typically takes 6 to 8 weeks. Then we'd better get started, Judge Hendricks replied. Patricia, you have 48 hours to file a motion requesting permission for Rex to accompany Emma during her testimony. Dr. Harrison, I want a comprehensive psychological evaluation documenting Emma's progress and Rex's necessity. Officer Torres, get that dog certified as a therapy animal immediately. As the meeting disbanded, Patricia felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration. She was about to either make legal history or destroy her career by turning a murder trial into what Kumar would certainly call a circus sideshow. But as she looked at the crime scene photos one more time, she knew she had no choice. 3 violent criminals were counting on an 8-year-old's silence to escape justice. Patricia Walsh was determined to prove them wrong, even if it meant putting a German shepherd on the witness stand. The Millfield County Courthouse had never seen anything like the media circus that erupted on the morning of March 15th. News vans lined Court Street 3 deep, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray Ohio sky like mechanical flowers seeking signal instead of sunlight. Reporters from CNN, Fox News, and every major network had descended upon the small town of 23,000 residents, transforming the quiet courthouse steps into a battlefield of competing narratives and shouted questions. This is Anderson Cooper reporting. Live from Millfield, Ohio, where legal history may be made today as Judge Robert Hendricks decides whether to allow the first therapy dog to serve as an emotional support companion during criminal testimony in the state's history. The silver-haired anchor announced to his camera crew, his breath visible in the cold March air. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was equally electric, but far more tense. Judge Hendricks' chambers had become command central for what court personnel were already calling the Rex decision. Law clerks scrambled to research precedents from every jurisdiction in the country, while bailiffs prepared for what could become the most contentious hearing in the courthouse's 89-year history. Defense attorney David Kumar had assembled what looked like a small army of legal experts to challenge the prosecution's motion. His team included a constitutional law professor from Ohio State University, a child psychology expert who specialized in debunking therapy animal claims, and a jury consultant whose job was to calculate exactly how much sympathy a German shepherd might generate in the courtroom. Your Honor, Kumar began his argument with theatrical precision, his $3,000 suit impeccable despite the early morning hour. What the prosecution is requesting isn't just unprecedented, it's a fundamental violation of my client's constitutional right to a fair trial. They want to parade a dog through the courtroom for the sole purpose of manipulating the jury's emotions and prejudicing them against the defendants. Kumar clicked to his first PowerPoint slide, displaying statistics about jury bias in cases involving children and animals. Psychological studies show that the presence of a dog increases jury sympathy for alleged victims by an average of 34%. The prosecution isn't seeking justice. Your Honor, they're seeking a conviction through emotional manipulation because their evidence isn't strong enough to stand on its own. Behind the defense table, Jake Morrison, Tommy Chun, and Lisa Brooks sat in orange jail jumpsuits, their expressions ranging from Morrison's cold confidence to Chun's nervous fidgeting. Morrison had been through the system enough times to recognize when prosecutors were desperate, and he was counting on Kumar's aggressive defense strategy to secure their freedom. Patricia Walsh rose to respond, carrying a thick brief that represented 2 weeks of 18-hour days researching every legal angle. Your Honor, the defense's argument fundamentally mischaracterizes what we're requesting. Rex isn't a prop or a sympathy device. He's a medically necessary accommodation for a severely traumatized witness, no different from providing a wheelchair for a disabled witness or an interpreter for someone who speaks a foreign language. She moved to her own presentation setup, displaying Dr. Harrison's detailed psychological evaluation of Emma. Dr. James Harrison, one of Ohio's leading child psychologists, has documented that Emma Rodriguez suffers from severe selective mutism directly resulting from witnessing this violent crime. After 4 months of traditional therapy failure, Rex has become the only catalyst that allows Emma to access her voice. Without Rex present, Emma cannot speak. With Rex present, She has begun vocalizing for the first time since October. Judge Hendricks interrupted, his weathered face grave with the weight of his decision. Ms. Walsh, the defense raises valid concerns about jury prejudice. How do we balance Emma's need for accommodation against the defendant's right to a fair trial? Your Honor, we propose strict limitations, Patricia responded, consulting her notes. Rex would be positioned out of the jury's direct line of sight, wearing a plain service vest with no police markings. Emma would testify via closed-circuit television, if necessary to minimize Rex's visual impact on the jury. The focus would remain entirely on Emma's testimony, not on the dog's presence. Kumar shot to his feet, his voice rising with practiced indignation. Your Honor, this entire proceeding is a circus designed to distract from the prosecution's weak case. They have no eyewitness testimony, no security camera footage, and DNA evidence that could have been planted or transferred innocently. Now, they want to bring in a dog to create sympathy because they know their case is falling apart. Outside the courthouse, the public had already chosen sides. A group of about 40 supporters held signs reading "Justice for Emma" and "Let her speak," while a smaller contingent of civil liberties advocates carried banners declaring "fair trial rights" and "no courtroom theater." The divide reflected a broader legal and philosophical question that would influence courts across the nation. Television legal commentators were having a field day with the controversy. Nancy Grace declared it a revolutionary step toward protecting child victims, while Alan Dershowitz called it a dangerous precedent that could undermine the presumption of innocence. Social media exploded with hashtags, #Let Emma Speak, and #Fair Trial First, turning a local Ohio case into a national referendum on victims' rights versus defendants' protections. Dr. Harrison was called to testify about Emma's condition, his usually calm demeanor showing signs of strain under Kumar's aggressive cross-examination. Doctor, isn't it true that you've only been working with therapy animals for 6 months? And isn't it also true that there are no peer-reviewed studies proving that dogs can facilitate testimony in criminal cases? Mr. Kumar, I've been treating traumatized children for 20 years, Dr. Harrison replied firmly. Emma's case is unique in its severity, but Rex's effect on her communication ability is documented and measurable. She has progressed from complete mutism to attempting words in Rex's presence. Remove Rex, and she returns to silence. The hearing's most dramatic moment came when Officer Torres was called to testify about Rex's qualifications and training. Kumar attempted to paint Rex as just another police dog with aggressive training, but Torres's testimony revealed Rex's gentle nature and specialized work with crime victims. Rex has comforted over 200 children during his 6 years of service, Torres explained, his voice thick with emotion. He's never shown aggression toward any civilian, and he's specifically trained to remain calm in high-stress situations. This dog has probably prevented more trauma than any therapist in this county. Judge Hendricks called a recess to review the mountain of legal briefs, expert testimony, and precedent cases. In his chambers, surrounded by law books and case files, he faced the most difficult decision of his judicial career. He could play it safe, deny the motion, and watch 3 violent criminals walk free when Emma couldn't testify. Or he could make legal history and risk having his decision overturned on appeal, potentially invalidating any conviction they might achieve. The judge's law clerk, a brilliant recent Harvard Law graduate named Jennifer Chun, knocked softly on his chamber door. Your Honor, I've finished researching the California and New York cases where therapy dogs were permitted during testimony. In all 3 instances, the convictions were upheld on appeal, and the courts specifically noted that proper accommodations for traumatized witnesses serve the interests of justice. Judge Hendricks looked out his window at the media crowd below, then at the photos of Mrs. Williams' injuries that Patricia had submitted as evidence. Catherine Williams remained in a coma, her life hanging in the balance while 3 criminals counted on legal technicalities to escape justice. When court reconvened 2 hours later, the gallery was packed beyond capacity. Reporters, legal experts, victim advocates, and curious citizens filled every available seat, while overflow crowds watched on monitors in adjacent courtrooms. Even the bailiff seemed nervous as Judge Hendricks prepared to announce his decision. After careful consideration of all testimony and legal precedent, Judge Hendricks began, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. This court finds that the prosecution's motion presents a compelling case for accommodation. However, this accommodation must be balanced against the defendant's constitutional rights to a fair trial. The courtroom held its collective breath as the judge continued. Therefore, this court hereby grants the prosecution's motion with the following strict conditions. Rex may accompany Emma Rodriguez during her testimony, positioned outside the jury's direct view, wearing plain civilian clothing rather than any police or service markings. The jury will be instructed that Rex's presence is a medical accommodation and should not influence their deliberations regarding the defendant's guilt or innocence. The gavel's sound echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, marking the moment when American legal history changed forever. Rex would become the first therapy dog officially permitted to provide emotional support during criminal testimony in Ohio, setting a precedent that would influence courts nationwide. Outside, the crowds erupted in cheers and protests as news of the decision spread across social media within minutes. But inside courtroom 3A, the real battle was just beginning. The morning of March 22nd dawned gray and cold in Millfield, Ohio, with a fine mist that clung to the courthouse windows like tears waiting to fall. Inside the building that had become the epicenter of national legal attention, final preparations were underway for what court reporters were already calling the most significant criminal testimony of the decade. Emma Rodriguez sat in the victim services room on the 3rd floor, her small frame dwarfed by the adult-sized chair while her mother, Maria, gently brushed her daughter's long dark hair. The yellow dress Emma wore had been chosen carefully. It was the same sunshine color she'd loved before that terrible October night, a deliberate attempt to reconnect her with the confident, chatty child she'd once been. "Mia, you don't have to be brave for anyone but yourself today," Maria whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she secured a small yellow ribbon in Emma's hair. "Rex will be right there with you, and we'll all be watching to make sure you're safe." Dr. Harrison observed from across the room, noting the subtle signs of Emma's emotional state. Her breathing was more controlled than it had been during their practice sessions, suggesting either remarkable composure or complete dissociation. Her hands, which usually trembled when discussing the attack, were steady as she clutched a small stuffed elephant, a comfort item Rex had helped her rediscover during their therapy sessions. Down the hall in the courthouse's makeshift K-9 preparation area, Officer Torres was conducting final checks on Rex's appearance and behavior. The German Shepherd wore a plain navy blue vest instead of his usual police gear, with no badges, patches, or anything that might remind jurors of law enforcement. Rex seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, sitting at perfect attention, while Torres brushed his coat and checked his specially designed comfort harness. "Today's the big day, partner," Torres murmured, running his weathered hands through Rex's thick fur. "That little girl is counting on you to help her find her voice. You've got to be perfect, calm, steady, focused. Can you do that for Emma?" Rex's intelligent amber eyes met his handler's gaze with the same focused intensity he'd once shown before major police operations. During their 6 years of partnership, Torres had learned to read Rex's emotional state as clearly as human body language. Today, the dog radiated purposeful calm, as if he understood that everything he'd learned about comforting traumatized individuals would be tested in the next few hours. Judge Hendricks had spent the previous evening reviewing security protocols with courthouse staff. Death threats had been received against Emma, her family, and even Rex, prompting the sheriff's department to implement unprecedented protection measures. Plainclothes officers were positioned throughout the courthouse, and every person entering the building passed through additional security screening. The courtroom itself had been reconfigured to accommodate the historic testimony. A small area near the witness stand had been designated for Rex, positioned where Emma could see him, but where his presence would be minimally visible to the jury. Court reporters had tested audio equipment to ensure Emma's potentially quiet voice would be clearly recorded, and backup systems were in place in case technology failed during this crucial moment. Defense attorney David Kumar made one final attempt to derail the proceedings, filing an emergency motion just 30 minutes before court was scheduled to convene. "Your Honor," he argued with barely contained frustration, "the media circus surrounding this case has made a fair trial impossible. My clients are being tried in the court of public opinion, with that dog serving as a symbol of their guilt before a single word of testimony has been heard." Kumar's desperation was evident to everyone present. His clients faced life sentences if convicted, and Emma's testimony, if she could deliver it, would likely seal their fate. Morrison, Chun, and Brooks sat at the defense table, their orange jail jumpsuits replaced with civilian clothes for the trial, but their nervous energy was palpable. Morrison's cold blue eyes, the same ones that had terrorized Emma that October night, scanned the courtroom with predatory calculation. Judge Hendricks denied Kumar's motion with uncharacteristic curtness. "Mr. Kumar, you've had ample opportunity to present your objections. This court has made its decision based on legal precedent and the compelling need to accommodate a traumatized witness. We will proceed as scheduled." At 10:15 a.m., the moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. The courtroom's heavy oak doors opened slowly, and Emma Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, looking impossibly small against the backdrop of the packed gallery. Rex walked beside her on his leash, matching her hesitant pace with the precision of a therapy animal who understood that his human needed him to be her anchor in a storm of overwhelming emotions. The gallery fell into complete silence as they made their way down the center aisle. Emma's steps were measured and deliberate, her gaze fixed straight ahead to avoid making eye contact with the defendants who had haunted her nightmares for 5 months. Rex maintained perfect heel position, his massive presence serving as both comfort and protection for the fragile child beside him. Prosecutor Patricia Walsh felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched Emma's approach. Everything the case, her career, justice for Mrs. Williams, and the future of accommodations for traumatized witnesses depended on whether an 8-year-old girl could find the courage to speak the words that would either convict 3 violent criminals or set them free. The jury watched in fascination and obvious sympathy as Emma reached the witness stand. Several jurors, particularly the mothers among them, visibly struggled to maintain their composure as they observed the small girl who had endured so much trauma. Despite Judge Hendricks' strict instructions about not allowing Rex's presence to influence their judgment, the emotional impact was undeniable. Rex positioned himself in his designated area, where Emma could see him clearly, but where his presence wouldn't dominate the jury's visual field. The dog lay down with practiced precision, his head raised just enough to maintain eye contact with Emma while his body language projected calm stability. Court clerk Jennifer Martinez approached Emma with the oath, speaking in the gentlest voice she could manage. "Emma, do you promise to tell the truth about what you saw and heard?" For a moment that felt like an eternity, Emma simply stared at the clerk, her lips moving silently, as if practicing words she wasn't sure she could speak. The courtroom held its collective breath, 200 people waiting to see if 5 months of therapy and preparation would be enough to overcome the psychological walls Trauma had built around this child. Rex sensed Emma's struggle and shifted slightly, not moving from his position, but adjusting his angle so that his warm amber eyes were fully focused on her face. The subtle movement drew Emma's attention, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, her rigid posture softened almost imperceptibly. "Yes," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible even with the enhanced audio system. "I promise." The single word sent a ripple of emotion through the gallery. Maria Rodriguez pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob of relief, while Dr. Harrison made a quick note documenting this breakthrough moment. Even Judge Hendricks, who had maintained judicial stoicism throughout the proceedings, allowed himself a small nod of encouragement. But everyone in the courtroom knew this was just the beginning. The real test would come when Patricia Walsh began, questioning Emma about the most traumatic night of her young life, forcing her to relive memories that had stolen her voice and shattered her sense of safety. As Prosecutor Walsh approached the witness stand, Emma's eyes found Rex once more. The German Shepherd's steady gaze seemed to communicate a silent message. "I'm here. You're safe. You can do this." The fate of 3 violent criminals and the future of how the justice system treats traumatized child witnesses now rested in the hands of a little girl and her 4-legged guardian angel. Prosecutor Patricia Walsh approached the witness stand with the careful precision of someone defusing a bomb. Every question had been rehearsed dozens of times with Dr. Harrison, every potential trigger word identified and alternatives prepared. The packed courtroom remained so silent that the old building's settling creaks sounded like gunshots in the tense atmosphere. "Emma," Patricia began, her voice gentle but clear enough for the court reporter to capture every word. "Can you tell us your name and how old you are?" Emma's lips moved silently for several seconds before any sound emerged. Emma Rodriguez. "I'm 8. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the enhanced audio system carried her words to every corner of the courtroom. "Emma, do you remember the night of October 15th when you were in your bedroom?" Patricia asked, deliberately starting with neutral territory before approaching the traumatic memories. Emma's breathing quickened immediately, her small hands gripping the arms of the witness chair until her knuckles turned white. Her eyes darted toward the defendant's table, where Jake Morrison sat with his cold blue eyes fixed on her like a predator studying prey. The same eyes that had haunted her nightmares for 5 months. Rex, attuned to every shift in Emma's emotional state, lifted his head slightly and gave a barely audible whine, not enough to disrupt the proceedings, but sufficient to draw Emma's attention back to his calming presence. Dr. Harrison had trained Rex to recognize the signs of Emma's anxiety, escalation, and provide gentle redirection before she became overwhelmed. I was scared of the thunder," Emma managed, her voice trembling. "It was really loud, and the lightning was bright." "What happened that made you look out your window?" Patricia continued, each question carefully designed to build Emma's confidence. "Before reaching the crucial moments, I heard breaking sounds, like glass and wood, and screaming." Emma's voice grew smaller with each word, her body beginning to curl inward as the memory surfaced. Defense attorney Kamar shifted in his seat, preparing to object if Patricia pushed too hard too fast, but Judge Hendricks' stern glare warned him against interrupting this delicate process. The judge had made it clear that Emma would be allowed to testify at her own pace, with minimal interference from legal technicalities. "Emma, when you looked out your window, what did you see?" Patricia asked, knowing this was the crucial moment, where Emma's testimony could either save the case or collapse entirely. Emma's breathing became rapid and shallow, classic signs of a panic response. Her eyes found Rex again, and the German Shepherd seemed to understand that his young friend was approaching a breaking point. Rex sat up straighter, his intelligent amber eyes locked on Emma's face with the same focused intensity. he'd once used during search and rescue operations. I saw 3 people in Mrs. Williams' house. They had masks on, and they were hurting her. She was screaming for help, but nobody came. Emma's voice broke on the last words, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks. The jury members were visibly affected by Emma's testimony. Juror number 7, a grandmother herself, discreetly wiped tears from her eyes. Even the court stenographer seemed to struggle maintaining professional composure as she recorded the child's words. Patricia knew she had to push forward while Emma was still able to speak. Emma, can you describe what these 3 people looked like? The tall one ... He was the leader. He had blue eyes, really scary blue eyes. The other man was shorter, and he kept laughing while he broke things. The woman wore a red jacket and watched. The door. Emma's voice grew stronger as she focused on the details, Rex's steady presence anchoring her to the present moment. Morrison's attorney whispered urgently in his client's ear, but Morrison's expression remained coldly confident. He had terrorized this child once before, and his arrogant demeanor suggested he believed he could break her again. Emma, what happened when the tall man looked toward your house? Patricia asked, approaching the most crucial part of Emma's testimony. Emma's entire body began to shake. Her breathing became erratic, and Dr. Harrison leaned forward in the gallery, ready to intervene if she showed signs of complete psychological shutdown. This was the moment they had all feared, when Emma would have to relive the exact instant. Her voice had been stolen. He saw me in the window. He pointed at me and ... and his eyes. Emma's voice disappeared entirely, her lips moving soundlessly as terror reclaimed her. Rex sensed the crisis immediately. The therapy dog rose from his lying position and moved slightly closer to Emma, careful not to leave his designated area, but positioning himself where his presence would be more powerfully felt. His movement was so smooth and purposeful that even Judge Hendricks made no move to stop him. But Emma remained silent, trapped once again in the paralyzing fear that had held her prisoner for 5 months. The courtroom watched helplessly as the little girl who had found her voice seemed to lose it again at the most critical moment. Patricia Walsh felt the case slipping away. Without Emma's identification of the defendants, particularly Morrison's distinctive blue eyes, the prosecution would lose their only eyewitness testimony. Kumar was already smiling slightly, sensing victory within his grasp. 20-7 agonizing minutes passed. Patricia tried different approaches, gentler questions, even suggesting a recess, but Emma remained locked in traumatic silence. The jury shifted restlessly, some members beginning to look skeptical about whether this child could actually provide reliable testimony. Then, something extraordinary happened. Rex, reading Emma's distress with the instincts of a therapy animal, who had comforted hundreds of trauma victims, made a decision that would change legal history. The German Shepherd rose to his full height and performed a perfect sit-stay. Commander Move Torres had taught him years earlier to demonstrate his training and discipline. The action was simple, professional, and completely within his behavioral parameters as a therapy dog. But for Emma, watching Rex demonstrate the same calm control and strength she desperately needed, it became a lifeline back to her voice. Emma looked directly into Rex's warm amber eyes, seeing not just a dog, but a partner who understood her fear and refused to let her face it alone. Rex's steady gaze seemed to communicate a silent message that penetrated through her trauma. You are brave. You are strong. You can do this. The courtroom held its collective breath as Emma's lips parted. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was crystal clear and carried to every corner of the silent room. Good boy. Those 2 simple words, spoken with genuine warmth and growing confidence, shattered the silence that had imprisoned Emma Rodriguez for 157 days. The courtroom erupted in barely suppressed gasps and whispered conversations as everyone realized they had just witnessed a miracle. But Emma wasn't finished. Those 2 words had been the key that unlocked her voice, and now, with Rex's steady presence giving her strength, the floodgates opened. The man with the blue eyes pointed at me, and I knew he would hurt me too if I told anyone what I saw. But Rex is here now, and he makes me feel safe, and Mrs. Williams needs someone to tell the truth about what those bad people did to her. Emma turned in her chair to look directly at the defendant's table, her voice growing stronger with each word. The tall man with the scary blue eyes is sitting right there. He's the one who hurt Mrs. Williams. The shorter man who was laughing is next to him, and the woman in the red jacket is on the end. For the first time in 5 months, Emma Rodriguez had found her voice, and she was using it to speak for justice. Morrison's face had gone ashen as his victim pointed directly at him. The cold confidence he'd maintained throughout the trial evaporated as he realized that his attempt to silence this child through intimidation had catastrophically failed. The 2 words, "good boy," had not only restored Emma's voice, they had sealed the fate of 3 violent criminals and changed the course of American legal history forever. The transformation in Emma Rodriguez was nothing short of miraculous. Once those 2 pivotal words, "good boy," had broken through the psychological barriers that had held her voice captive for 157 days, Emma became an unstoppable force of truth and determination. With Rex's steady amber eyes providing constant reassurance, she delivered testimony that would be studied in law schools for generations to come. The tall man with the blue eyes, he told the others to find the old ladies. Money, Emma continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. He said if they found any witnesses, they would visit them later to make sure they stayed quiet. That's when he saw me in my window and pointed at me. I knew he meant to hurt me if I told anyone. Defense attorney David Kummer's face had turned the color of ash as his carefully constructed defense crumbled with every word from the 8-year-old witness. His clients Morrison, Chun, and Brooks sat in stunned silence as the child they had tried to intimidate into silence systematically destroyed their alibis and identified details only someone present during the crime could have known. The shorter man, the one who was laughing, Emma said, pointing directly at Tommy Chun. He had a scar on his left hand shaped like a crescent moon. I saw it when he threw Mrs. Williams' picture frames on the floor. And the woman, she continued, her gaze shifting to Lisa Brooks. She kept checking her phone and telling the others to hurry up because the old lady's neighbor works nights and might come home early. Patricia Walsh felt a surge of triumph as Emma provided detail after detail that perfectly corroborated the physical evidence. The scar on Chun's hand was documented in his arrest records. Brooks's cell phone records showed multiple calls during the time of the break-in. Most importantly, Emma's description of Morris's distinctive pale blue eyes and commanding presence matched witness descriptions from 3 other unsolved elderly victim cases. Emma's testimony continued for another hour, interrupted only by gentle breaks when Dr. Harrison observed signs of fatigue. Throughout it all, Rex remained in his position like a furry guardian angel, his presence transforming Emma from a traumatized victim into a powerful advocate for justice. Mrs. Williams tried to tell them she didn't have much money, Emma recalled, her voice steady now despite the terrible memories. But the blue-eyed man said they knew she had inheritance money from her husband's death. He said they'd been watching her for weeks, learning her schedule. This revelation sent shockwaves through the prosecution team. Emma's testimony had just provided evidence of premeditation and stalking, factors that would elevate the charges and ensure longer sentences for all 3 defendants. When Emma's testimony concluded at 2:47 p.m., Judge Hendricks called for a brief recess. As Emma stepped down from the witness stand, she paused next to Rex and wrapped her small arms around his neck in a hug that brought tears to eyes throughout the courtroom. "Thank you for helping me be brave," she whispered into Rex's fur, loud. Enough for the court reporter to capture her words for posterity. The jury deliberation that followed was the shortest in Millfield County history for a case of this magnitude. 3 hours and 14 minutes after they began deliberating, the 12 jurors returned with verdicts that would resonate far beyond the walls of this small Ohio courthouse. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Hendricks asked, his voice carrying the weight of the historic moment. "We have, Your Honor," replied the jury foreman, a retired factory worker whose own granddaughter was Emma's age. "On the charge of aggravated burglary against Jake Morrison, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of felonious assault against Jake Morrison, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of attempted murder against Jake Morrison, we find the defendant guilty." The verdicts continued for all 3 defendants across multiple charges. Morrison received 3 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole for 30 years. Chun was sentenced to 45 years in prison. Brooks, who had served as lookout but hadn't directly participated in the assault, received 25 years. As the bailiffs led the convicted criminals away in shackles, Morrison's cold blue eyes found Emma one last time. But instead of the terrified child he had intimidated 5 months earlier, he saw a strong young girl who had found her voice and used it to ensure he would never hurt anyone again. The immediate aftermath of the trial created a legal revolution that spread across the United States like wildfire. Within 6 months, 12 states had passed Emma's Law legislation, specifically allowing therapy animals to accompany traumatized witnesses during testimony. Law schools began teaching courses on trauma-informed courtroom procedures, and therapy dog training programs expanded nationwide to meet the growing demand. Rex became the most famous German Shepherd in America, his story inspiring the creation of the National Courthouse Therapy Dog Program. Officer Torres, who had initially worried about his partner's retirement, found himself traveling across the country, training other dogs and handlers in Rex's revolutionary techniques. The duo appeared on countless television shows, wrote a best-selling book titled Finding Voices, and established a foundation that provided therapy dogs to courts in underserved communities. For Emma Rodriguez, the trial's conclusion marked the beginning of a remarkable recovery. Within weeks of testifying, she had returned to being the chatty, energetic 8-year-old she had been before the attack. She excelled in school, made new friends, and even started a Kids in Canine South Club at Millfield Elementary that taught other children about therapy animals. Emma's relationship with Rex continued long after the trial ended. Every Saturday, she visited Rex at Officer Torres' home, where they practiced agility courses, played fetch, and simply enjoyed each other's company. Rex, who had initially been scheduled for quiet retirement, found new purpose as a certified therapy dog working with other traumatized children throughout Ohio. Mrs. Catherine Williams made a miraculous recovery that doctors attributed partly to learning about Emma's courage in testifying. When she finally left the hospital 7 months after the attack, her first stop was the Rodriguez home to thank the little girl who had ensured her attackers faced justice. Mrs. Williams adopted a golden retriever therapy dog named Hope and began volunteering with trauma victims at the hospital where she had recovered. The legal precedent set by Emma's case influenced courts nationwide. The Supreme Court eventually heard a related case and ruled unanimously that properly regulated therapy animal accommodations for traumatized witnesses served the constitutional interests of justice without violating defendants' rights to fair trials. Emma's 2 words, "good boy," had not only restored her own voice, but had given voice to countless other victims who needed therapeutic support to testify against their attackers. Her courage in that Millfield courtroom proved that sometimes the smallest witnesses, with the right support, can roar the loudest for justice. 5 years later, Emma Rodriguez, now 13 and aspiring to become a lawyer herself, still keeps a photo on her bedroom wall. It shows her 8-year-old self in a yellow dress, standing next to a majestic German shepherd, whose warm amber eyes helped her find her voice when she needed it most. The inscription beneath the photo reads simply, "Good boy, Rex. Thank you for teaching me that courage comes in all sizes, even with 4 paws and a wagging tail." Their story had proven that healing, justice, and hope could triumph over even the darkest trauma, creating a legacy that would protect vulnerable witnesses for generations to come. In the end, 2 simple words spoken by a brave little girl had changed not just her own life, but the entire American legal system's approach to supporting those who dare to speak truth in the face of evil.